Jenna, honey, welcome to the Energized podcast. Oh, it is a pleasure to get to have you here. I've been prepping all week for this interview. I've been talking to friends, even my husband. I think my son may know I'm doing this interview today.
Everybody knows. I'm so
Everybody
happy to
knows.
be here. Thank you
um,
for having me.
Oh my goodness, such a pleasure. I've been diving into your book. I'm almost done with it. And just congratulations on that. And what I would love to do, just diving in, because I just love your work and your book, The Origins of You. And I know that in that book, you're unlocking a healing process to help the reader, help all of us understand our family of origin and that framework, and
Mhm.
to kind of figure out like how we operate in that system and how we can heal from whatever we kind of took on from that. And I was
Mhm.
curious for you in your development of this process, what was that defining moment for you where you understood that not only do all of us have some level of childhood wounds, but that you even discovered that maybe that it was kind of that it was playing out for you as well. So was there a defining moment for you where you're just like, aha, like this is the thing that so many of us could benefit from if we really understood it?
Yeah, I think I still have those moments, honestly. And, the gift that keeps on giving, which is life and
Yes.
relationships that hold mirrors back to us. And, I also have a little boy, close in age to yours. Right. And it's like, oh, these kiddos, they hold up the mirrors, and our partners hold up the mirrors, and our reactivity holds up the mirrors. Right. It's like all of that keeps on pointing us back to the things that are unresolved from the past. And I do think there's a few that stand out, but there was one in my mid to late 20s. I was dating someone, and his ex came back in the picture, and he's trying to figure out whether he was going to go back into the relationship with her or stay in the relationship with me. And then insert Vienna, who I chalk some of this up to being a therapist, but also a lot of this up to my wounding, which I can share a little bit more about. But cue Vienna, and I'm like, of course, no worries, take all the time you need, if you need to spend time with her to understand, and yada yada yada. Mind you, all this while we're actually in a relationship. And I constantly during that time pretended like I was fine, I was okay, I was unaffected. I was the cool girl. I always say that I held on to this persona that I wanted to be the cool girl, and present that way. And I did for a couple of weeks during that time. And then I remember having a conversation with a friend, and so much of it clicked in because I saw so clearly that this role that I was holding on to, embodying at this point in my life, was the same role that I had taken on as a little girl. So rewind. My parents went through a 9-year divorce process when I was in first grade. I'm an only child, so I was a tiny little human in this system that was crashing and burning around me. It was extreme. It was really extreme. There was a lot of manipulation, gaslighting, psychological abuse, paranoia, emotional flooding, high, high, high conflict. It was a really scary environment to be in a
Yeah.
lot of different ways. And, as a tiny little human, the way that I decided to deal with that was to pretend to be fine, to pretend to be unaffected, to get good at the things that I put my mind to. And so I was tiny at the time, but like as I was growing up, right, it's like, okay, violin and sports and German and, and from the outside looking in, I was this very well adjusted child. I mean, people commented on it all the time. Wow, she's so well adjusted. Wow, she's so well rounded. Wow, 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 wow. I was like, I have successfully deceived everyone. I did get good at those things, but I successfully deceived people into believing that I was okay. And I needed to be okay from my point of view because there wasn't room for me to not be okay. I looked at the adults in my life who were crashing and burning around me, who were unwell, and I believed that there wasn't room for me to not be well too. And so I pretended, and I pretended from that point on. And decades later, right, I was this needless little girl who turned into a needless woman who was boundaryless, who pretended like she was okay and fine, who believed that if she brought anything forward that wasn't okay, I'm fine, would mean that there would be ruptures in the relationships, that people would leave, that it wouldn't be okay, that the system couldn't withstand me not being okay, if that makes sense. And so, when you ask, is there a pivotal moment? Here I am in my like mid late 20s. And listen, I was already a therapist at that point. I went into my graduate work right after university and, was a practicing clinician, at 23 years old. And, I was a good enough therapist, for a period of time. But, I joke, anybody who gets into this line of work, whether we know it or not, we're coming in to resolve that which is unresolved. And, I didn't know it at the time when I entered into grad school. I was like, oh, my parents divorced. It didn't affect me. I'm good. Like, they're good friends. Everybody's fine. Like, we do holidays together now, which is true. And there had been a huge evolution in their relationship. But what was not true was that their divorce didn't affect me. And I did not know how to let myself be affected. I mean, this just wasn't something that I had practiced. I didn't know how to be with emotion. And that might sound shocking, thinking, oh my gosh, here's this person who was a therapist. And I was a good therapist, but I think when I started to work with people more and more, because now I've, worked over 25,000 hours with individuals, couples, and families in direct clinical work, it's like every single time we get to this place where there's an unwanted pattern, right? Where there's this loop, where there's this thing that we can't change, that we say that we want to change, it's pointing to something from before this moment that has not been resolved. And, so that was the personal story from my life that really like had me turn back around. It's like I knew intellectually this stuff, right? Because I had studied it, but it was something that I really had to live through, really break through, because even in the early years of being a therapist, I was still trying to push away the idea that I had had pain, that I had had trauma, that I had had wounds that had never been acknowledged, that had never been addressed, that had never been tended to. Right. And like, that's what I say about pain. It's like, it just wants our acknowledgement. Pain's not out
Mm.
to destroy us. It's not out to get us. It's not rubbing its hands together cynically, laughing at us, saying like, ha ha ha, here's another pattern I'm going to drop in her lap. Right. It's like, hey, I'm going to keep poking my head up and I'm going to keep presenting patterns for you because I would really love for you to turn back around to me and acknowledge me, to see me, to honor me. We don't have to stay here forever. And I promise you that when you do that, my grip on you will loosen. And that is what happens. And, I've been the great honor of working with people day in and day out. And so, professionally, I see this all the time, even when people come in and they're like, no, 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 my family was perfect. Like, okay, give me one more session, right? We're gonna get somewhere. And it's such a big LOL because so many people, months later are like, oh my God, remember when I came in the first time and I told you my family was perfect and there's nothing there and you're not going to find anything. And then, right, like weeks, months later, and we're unpacking, big stuff. But I know that this is hard to look at. And I know that there's plenty of reasons that we don't want to go there, right? That we just want to keep our eye on the prize and keep moving forward. And the stuff from the past, from decades ago, doesn't have a hold on us. And like, let's just keep chugging along. But what I have found, both personally and professionally, is that anywhere that there is a level of stuckness, right? Where there are those unwanted patterns that keep showing up, where there is the reactivity, where it is we give people advice, but we can't take it ourselves, where we have outsized reactions to things, right? Like those are the arrows that point us back into, looking at our family of origin, looking at the family systems that we grew up in, and really understanding what it is that we experienced there and what it is that we observed, right? Because sometimes things don't happen directly to us, but sometimes it's what it is that we see between dad and sister or the parents or, some other dyad in the dynamic. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of invitations for me to look back at this and really, dissect it and unpack it as much as possible.
I have a personal question more so because, you telling me that you have a little one, we're close to age.
Yes.
And, going
Yes.
through such a painful, long, drawn out divorce,
Mhm.
where there was a lot of, I mean, I read the book and, just the idea of if you and your mama being in that closet, like what a scary day that had
Mhm.
to have been. Um, and then, was when you were kind of, you know, doing a lot of the review for yourself in the decision to become a mother, was there a process for you in terms of looking back, or had you felt like you had done a lot of the origin work going in, or did you have an intention of what you would love for it to look like coming into this new into becoming a
Mhm.
mom, like after living
Yeah.
through that? Did you have an intention for how you and your husband wanted to show up, or how you especially wanted to show up for your
Mhm.
your child coming in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I had a child at I guess I think I was 35. Um, it's so funny. It feels like there's a point where it all jumbles together.
It
And
totally
you're like, I
does.
don't know how old I am anymore. And like, it doesn't matter. I don't know what the years are. But yes, so uh, I had waited a little bit of time, and that was important because there had been a lot of healing and a lot of attention to what it is that you're talking about. And my husband, same, right? So he's a couple of years older than me. And I'm I feel lucky to have a partner who is as, self-aware and, committed to this work as I am. And there was so much that I feel like had been kind of flushed out and resolved. And we had talked about so much before entering into this space. But what I think is a little bit funny is that uh, I think it is easier that I had a little boy first. Um, that's all that I have right now. But I think it would have been slightly more complicated had it been a little girl for me. So we
Mhm.
we laugh, my husband and I, because we're like, all right, well, his lessons came first. Right. And it's like,
Right.
but there's right where it's like, ooh, like because being a little girl myself and sort of the expectations that I held for me, like there was still some work that I felt like I needed to do to almost like make space and room for a little girl to
Yeah.
enter, if God willing, if that's something that happens at some point. But it's a really interesting question because I think there's a preparation to a certain degree, but also so many parents ask me like, how do you make sure that you don't create wounds for your children? You're like, you will, we know
Right.
that for sure. We try to do our best to minimize the big stuff, right? It's like we want to try to protect as much as possible. But what I find so important, and what was really important for me was, can I be in a place where I can rush to repair as quickly as possible? Can I be in a place as a mother where I can get to a place of ownership, accountability, and apology, right? Can I move my stuff out of the way in order to get to that place? Because repair is the thing that matters. It's not, you have a little you're going to disappoint your children. You're going to let them down. You're going to say the wrong things sometimes. We're going to do our best not to do those things, but we know that they're going to happen sometimes. We're going to have a strong reaction one day when we're like, oh, shoot, I didn't,
My bad.
ah, yuck, I didn't
I'm
want to do
working
that.
so
Right.
hard to not ever
Yes.
have that happen. And God
Yeah.
willing, it hasn't yet. But
Yeah.
who knows, you know,
But who,
but
of course, but
yes,
like their life,
there could be a
human,
day
hi,
where you're just
hello.
beyond
Yes.
exhausted and it all just kind of hits the fan. But yeah, repair is
Yes.
everything, you know.
Repair is everything. And I think that's part of it is like, the intention of minimizing as much pain as possible, good. The idea that your child is going to get through the entirety of their lives without any rupture whatsoever feels really far off. And really, like,
Mhm.
part of their work too is coming back from that as well. And so for me, like stepping into parenthood absolutely was a commitment to continuing to resolve that which is unresolved. Not, I need to be perfect. I need to have resolved every possible last thing before I step into this, but just a commitment to continuing to resolve that which is unresolved, and a commitment to repair, to take ownership, accountability, to apologize as quickly as possible, and to not let, ego or stubbornness or whatever get
Get in
in
the
the way of
way.
that.
That is so
Yeah.
beautiful. And I love that because there feels like so much permission and
Mm.
spaciousness there. that feels so good, because I know that there are a lot of mamas listening to this who have teenagers, who have 20-year-olds. I know, Dr. Becky talked in her last TED talk was just about, people want to know, is it too late? And it's never too late. Like, you always get to
No.
repair. I will say that,
Yes.
as I've had
Even
my,
if
yeah.
even if they're pissed at you, even if they're like, I still hate you, even if whatever it is, right? To still go through the motions authentically, wholeheartedly, right? Like that penetrates something, even if your teenager is still like, screw you, or
Mm-hmm,
slams the door
mm-hmm.
or whatever it might be, right? Like I feel like that part is so important, is that you have to go through the motions authentically, wholeheartedly, regardless of the outcome, regardless of getting them to do something in return to you.
I agree. Thank you. That really gives, because I wanted to speak into that, because I know maybe someone's listening and they're like, my kids are such and such old, and and maybe it's too late, and I don't think it ever is. My mom, I talk about it on the show, but it was a very tumultuous and abusive, childhood, and my mom has witnessed me raise my son, her grandson, and I think she apologizes every time she comes over. Every Because I think she's just so mind blown about how different it is, how I talk to him, the way that I
Yeah.
respond to him. She's just like, what is that?
Yeah.
Like, she's
It's a
just like, oh
different
my
world.
God, I just didn't know. I just had no idea. And I think a lot of us, as family dynamics, it's interesting, and I'd love to hear your take on this. As family, I find this generation, Gen Z or younger, and myself, or people younger than myself, when we are digging deep into our patterns. We are digging deep into our wounding, and really trying to become better people, not only for ourselves and in loving ourselves and trusting ourselves, but in our relationships, and especially as, hopefully, as parents as well. And we know that generations before us didn't have the tools that we have today. And I was curious to you, like, how have you seen that dynamic play out, where you've got, you take yourself, doing the work, and then maybe you've got a grandma who
Mhm.
isn't doing, who doesn't even know that there was work to be done, and so I
Yeah.
was curious how that plays out, or have you seen that play out,
Yeah.
particularly this last decade or so?
Yeah, I think it's the balance of, grace and compassion for the human, and also accountability and ownership. It's like we know that there's context, and I think context is very important, but context is also not an excuse maker. And I think, as it's so important for us to be in the nuance of that and navigate those relationships this way. You probably haven't gotten to this part in the book, because I know you have a little bit more to read, but right at the end of the book, there's a exercise that is offered, and it's an exercise from Michael Kerr, and he says, I want you to think of your mother as your grandmother's daughter, and see how that shifts your perspective.
Mm,
And I
mm.
really appreciate that. Again, not because it's an offering for excuse making, but it is an offering to remind us that every single person was a tiny little human at one point, who was growing up in a family system that likely had some complexity to it, that likely had some complications to it, where there was probably some pain, or medium amount of pain, or a lot of pain, and some wounding and some trauma, right? And it's like, when
Yeah.
we can remember, when we can hold these individuals with a little bit of that in mind, I think that is where the grace and compassion comes in. Now, also,
Yes, and
ownership and accountability and responsibility, right? And that's the piece, is like we kind of toggle back and forth between this. Yes, the generation before, they didn't have as much support in this area. Going to therapy, it's something that a lot more people do today. We have social media that talks about this on so many different pages, right? It's like it's so common now for people to be in this work without there being shame or embarrassment around it. And so there's a lot more openness, and a lot more sources for people to pull from. now, which is beautiful. But I think it's the part where, your mama is like, oh my gosh, like this is a different world probably for her to see you
Mm-hmm.
parenting the way that you are.
Yeah.
And I don't
And
know what that does
beautiful,
for her.
I
Yeah.
think she's hopeful
Hmm.
and grateful and to
Yeah.
some degree. And we were literally, we're talking about, you and I were just talking about family dynamics, and I do
Hmm.
want to switch over to that right now because I know many people are in family dynamics at the moment. And my
Yeah.
mama was in a family dynamic with her mother just a couple of weeks
Hmm.
ago on talking about me actually. And my mom
Hmm.
kind of rising to the occasion to defend me over it doesn't really matter, but my mom, said, she's like, why was I chosen to be this woman's daughter? It's just, there's so much pain
Hmm.
there. And I have so
Hmm.
much compassion. I remember apologizing to her because I just felt she's never felt loved by her mother. And
Hmm.
it's just so heartbreaking to me. The idea, like being a mom now,
Yeah.
and I can't even imagine, just the
Hmm.
the 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 oozing of love everywhere. You know what I'm saying? It's all over our home. It's everywhere. My son can't escape it. If anything, he's over hugging everyone at school right now. Like there's a lot of hugs going on, and we
Hmm.
need to respect other kids' autonomy. But and so it's such a different energy than what my mom grew up. And so I love that question. And I feel like I've imagined my mom as a little person
Yeah.
so many times, and I've been so heartbroken for her, you know.
That's right. Yeah. And also, we know that healing can also happen in the other direction too. Right.
Mm.
And so, being loved by you, watching your love for your son, right? Like those are things that can be really deeply healing for someone. But yeah, that's heartbreaking, to hear your mom say something like that. Like, oh, why was I chosen to be this woman's daughter? Right? This is a painful role to have. And it also sounds like, there hasn't been resolution there. And that piece, right, that like kind of goes and goes and goes when somebody doesn't change, right? When somebody just stays exactly the same way as they were decade after decade after decade after decade. Because I know, your mom's mom is pretty old now,
90.
I
Yeah.
imagine, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right. And so it's like, oh, 90 years on this earth and still presenting this way. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's reasons and there's context for it. And maybe we don't know much about it, but it's so painful and so hurtful for your mama. And, I think when we do this work, it's an interesting perspective because a lot of times when people hear like, oh, well, people like to minimize their stories sometimes,
Absolutely.
and or they invalidate it or they explain it away or they rationalize it, and they're like, well, my mom was so much better than how her mom was to her, right? You hear that all the
Mm-hmm.
time. It's like people
Mm-hmm.
don't want to go into that space, or they did the best that they could with what they had or what they knew, and it's like, yep, true,
And
and true and true and true, and like our work is to be with the and, right? It's to be able to honor the fact that, like, yes, absolutely, they were little humans who had a hard go as well. And I still have to acknowledge my story. I still have to honor what happened in my life so that I can move it, right? So that I can find an internal peace, so that I can have the life and relationships that I desire, that I crave for, that I say that I want, so I can set the boundaries that I'd like to set, so that I can navigate conflict differently than I have been, right? It's like, if we want these changes, then we have to honor and acknowledge our stories properly.
Mm. One of the things you talked about, and I've talked to a lot of friends over the years about, that kind of that response of, but my childhood was good, or it was good enough. And I have friends who were abused by their uncle, or they're abused by their parents, or they were put into foster care. And so there's that a minimizing that ends up happening, that where we're like, well, our trauma isn't as big as their trauma, so it can't be a big
Right.
trauma. And
Right.
I'm curious, in what I've read in the book and what I've known to be true forever. And I used to think that my trauma was bigger than other people's traumas when I was a little girl. I was, and I thought, yeah, and so I feel like I played into that on the other direction. Um, but one of the things I think I walked away from in the book is that, obviously, little t's or big t's or whatever the system was, that it has an impact, especially if we're seeing patterns come up,
Mhm.
play out all the time. I guess the question I
Right.
have is, is it important for us to go back and try to figure out what it was in order for us to heal that pattern? Because I know for some people, they have a hard time figuring it out because maybe there's just all that stuff of like, it was fine.
Mhm. Yeah, I call that wound comparison,
Okay. Yeah.
right? Is that we get caught in wound comparison. And actually, both ways, I love that you bring forward that you would say, my trauma is bigger than other people's, right? As you hear people say, oh, well, if somebody else had it way worse than I did. Either one, all of that. Any type of wound comparison is a distraction away from your pain. Guess what
Mhm.
happens when you're like, my trauma is so big, my trauma is so big. You know what you're doing? You're just talking about how big your trauma is.
Right.
Is still distracting away from what needs to happen. Oh, mine's not so bad. Mine's not so bad compared to this person. Distraction away. Right. And so, yeah, like this work of coming back into presence and, acknowledgement and honoring. It's a great question. Some people can't remember, right?
Yeah.
It's with the systems protecting from it. We're not ready to go there. We don't have the memory of it. It's too far gone. For some of us, we do have the memories. I love, my work, of course, is family of origin work, and the origin, right, of the wound for me is a really powerful, is a powerful process of like, when is the first time that this shifted the trajectory, right? That this changed the way that I relate to my worthiness, the way that I relate to my belonging, my prioritization, my trust, my safety. But if we can't remember, that's okay. Then you go to the first time you can remember it, or the last time, even if it was 10 years ago. And it doesn't
Mm.
matter if we get caught up searching, searching, searching. Because sometimes people are like, well, there was nothing in 4 or 5 or 6 years old, right? They get caught in these early
Right. Because they're
years and
like,
we're
those are
like,
supposed to be the
yes,
years. It had
those
to
are
be
supposed
within
to
that
be years,
window before
right? And
7.
it's like, yeah. And it's like, no, no, no. It could be 13 and it could be 21, right? It's like the first time something happens that disrupts something significant, that sets the framework, that sets the tone and the way that we relate. These are the 5 origin wounds that I talk about in the book: are worthiness, belonging, prioritization, trust, and safety. And, when I sat down to write the book, I'm, going through like, what are all the wounds that all of us have ever experienced in our lives? And I'm like scribbling everything down. And ultimately, I felt like these 5 really encompassed the human experience. They're just labels, but they're not boxes for us to, fit into. And it's also not true that whatever your experience is means that it goes with a wound. It's how we internalize it. So, for example, if dad leaves and there's an abandonment there, one person might internalize that as a worthiness wound, meaning, I wasn't good enough for you to stick around and stay. For someone else, they might internalize it as a trust wound. The closest people in our lives are not to be trusted because they're just going to leave. Right. So I give that example because it's like sometimes people are like, oh, where do I fit in the wounds? And it's this very personal experience and inquiry of being like, how did I internalize the things that happened in my life? Right. So we don't have to get like, I think it's important to understand parts of our story, of course, without getting lost searching for something that we can't find, right? So it's like, look for it, but gosh, if like 3 months in, you're like, I don't know, I don't have the memory, then that's a distraction too, right? Like where you're like,
Mm.
I have to pinpoint the thing because it has to make sense to me, because sometimes people get so caught up in the dots have to connect. And sometimes the dot is just a sensation, you know?
Mm.
Sometimes the dot is just a knowing of something without being like, here's the actual facts of what went down.
Yeah. Yeah. I was curious. And also, I was curious because I know sometimes some of these memories, and maybe one of the reasons why they're being gated in the body, can be so painful, to pull up
Yeah.
and to relive. I feel like there's going to be so much kind of relived trauma in that. I know for me, I felt like I was stuck in a loop for many, many years, kind of the big trauma memory, kind of something very similar to what happened to you, played out. And it was very much tied to a worthiness. But I remember, as a child, I was stuck in the loop of it for so long, because it was just so painful. And that's why I was curious to know, how deep do we go into that if it is so painful? And then is it necessary for healing those patterns, that worthiness pattern? Like, is there some fluidity in terms of, does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. I mean, listen, I think that the goal is not to relive our trauma. The goal is to bear witness to it.
Mm.
And that to me is there's such a distinction there,
I
right?
agree.
And listen, I think for many people doing this work, you need to do it with a professional.
Yeah.
You need to do it with someone who's going to be able to walk through this with you, right? For some people, they might be able to do this on their own, and they don't need somebody to sort of like walk hand in hand with them. But for some people, especially if you have trauma or complex trauma, like absolutely highly recommend working with someone who is qualified to walk alongside of you. But it's not about reliving the trauma and the pain. It's about bearing witness to it. We need to bear witness. Witnessing has to happen in our healing. I mean, that has just been my experience personally and professionally. And I don't know how it moves without it. I haven't seen that happen where it's like, okay, how do you heal something if you
Mm.
don't
You don't
have it
know.
witnessed?
Mhm.
Yeah. Right. And so it's like, I think there's this like kind of nuanced difference to like, oh, like, let's just try to remember the pain. Let's just try to remember the detail. No, we don't have to do that. We have to bear witness, though, to little her, little
Yeah.
him, right? Like we have to bear witness. And I don't need every single detail. And again, like you said, we don't always remember all of the details anyway.
Mhm.
It's not important. If they're there,
Mhm.
okay, they're there, but we don't have to go digging for them. We just have to bear witness. And that's part of the origin healing practice is like, it feels very important to identify, where the wounds are, which wounds we have. Some people like, I had some people after they read the book, they're like, is it
Huh.
possible to have all five? I'm like, yes.
I
Like,
have
what
I
does that
have
mean? Doesn't mean
many
anything,
of
right?
the five
Yes. Yes.
from
Right.
different
It's
situations, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think the categories, if you will, is just a framework. It helps us, right? Like have a language for something of like,
Yeah.
right, that's my worthiness wound that's activated, or oh, right, that's my prioritization wound that is activated here. But it's like, yeah, you might have one, you might have multiple, you might have all five. Yeah, we both have a number of them. But we have to work ourselves through, naming and identifying what the wounds are, bearing witness. So, self with self, gosh, when we can get witnessed by someone else outside of us, oh, there's very little that is more beautiful than that and more profound than that. So if we had that, whether it's a partner, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a trusted, safe friend, beautiful, grieving, that has to be a part of it too. And then the last part in the origin healing practice is about the pivot, right? Is about like, okay, as I've done this work, as I've spent enough time witnessing and grieving, right, there's a bit of space that starts to take shape, right?
Mm.
Between sort of reactivity and how we respond to that reactivity, right? Like how we're going to communicate back or deal with our boundaries or be in conflict or how we're going to protect ourselves, right? Because when our wounds get activated present day, that emotional armor comes out, right? Like we're going to go to
Like in a
battle, right?
millisecond,
Yes,
like
in
in
a
it.
millisecond, it's there, right? And it's here to protect. But what always tends to happen, right? Like when we're coming from this place when we're not super present with ourselves or we don't know what's actually happening in our internal experiences, that our protection is all about disconnection from somebody else, right? It moves us further away. We get, for me, the way it looked was point proving. That's where I would go.
Mm.
I needed to be right. I was a point prover. I remember having a conflict with my partner before we were married. I have no clue what we were fighting about, but I do know that I was like proving my point and I was doubling down and tripling down. He's like, I got it. I got it. I got it. I'm like, no, 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 no. And I'm continuing to go and I'm continuing to prove my point. I'm like, have an out of body experience. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so gross. We're going to stop doing this. And then finally I stop. Shame enters in, little spiral goes. And then finally I'm like, get out of here, get curious, replace shame with curiosity. Because these behaviors that we bring forward, right, we know they're protective, they're protecting something. But if you just stay in shame, you're never going to understand what it is. So you have to bring in curiosity. And I got really curious, like, what does needing to be right protect you from?
Mm.
And that arrow took me right back into my family system. As I said before, there was a lot of gaslighting and manipulation, psychological abuse that took place. And I watched that. It wasn't directed towards me, but it was directed towards my mom. And I remember, my dad was just really quick with his words and he was just a master manipulator. And I remember watching it and I remember thinking, okay, safety, power, control over here. That's
Here,
what
like
heal,
he's nailing
love.
it over
Yes,
here.
he's
He's
nailing it
winning.
over here. He's winning. And that's where protection and safety is. And
Hmm.
she over here is not
Not
winning
winning.
because it was crazy. Of course, it was crazy making. Of course it was. Right. And it was like, disempowered and unwell and right all of the things. I was like, ooh, not safe, losing, right? And so when I finally was able to connect to that, I had so much more compassion for myself. It's like, oh, being right protects me. Being right is equal to my safety. Now, I'm a grown up, I'm an adult. So I cannot just keep acting that way, right? Because that behavior cannot just keep going and going and going unchecked. But I needed to understand that. I needed to see why this behavior was, how it was protecting me from something, what it was protecting me from, in order to work with it differently. And I cannot, and listen, do I ever prove my point still to this day? You betcha. But
Yeah.
it's, right. But it's so different. There's so much awareness of it. And how quickly I'm like, oh, but I'm just trying to protect myself, right? Like I'm not actually trying to destroy the other person or like disconnect from my husband or whomever, right? Like there's something that I'm trying to protect. And when I can take a moment to be with that, then I can work with that differently. And right, that's the beauty of the pivot, right? Is that when we understand our stories, when we spend more time with our pain and our wounds, when we do some of this healing work, then we have more of that space in between. We know that quote attributed to Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response, right?
Yeah.
And it's like that gap
That's the
widens.
gap. Yeah.
That gap widens,
Yeah.
right? And then we can choose differently in that gap. That's the
Mm.
goal. That's the hope, right?
That, yes, beautiful. And that, I think that leads me to my next question. Um, because it's all safety. I was having this conversation with my husband. Success was a way of me creating safety for me for a long time, and an awareness of that. If I find myself kind of going in survival mode in my business or my mission or whatever, I'm like, what's this? I know this pattern. This is my
Right.
strongest pattern. This is how I got out of childhood, and it's my ultimate safety hack. But what I've noticed, and this has been the kind of the thing that I've noticed, especially as a mom to a toddler, is I I'm a quote that I love by Mary Morrissey is notice what you notice. It's kind of similar to that, just like noticing. And I'm finding myself all like vigilantly noticing what I'm noticing because it's interesting. Although I've known my patterns for a long time, and yes, they're easier to identify. Man, they love to creep on in like more often than I appreciate. And so, and I wanted to ask about that because the kind of the consensus is that if these patterns were driving you for decades and
Yeah.
kept you in survival, and allowed you to make it through, are they always going to be there? And you're
Mm.
just, and it's just a matter of awareness and just like, the curiosity of like, oh, this is what's coming up, or oh, here it comes. I was
Yeah.
curious if it
You,
if it
you
ever stops.
you have to work with them very carefully because the things that allowed us to survive, mm, We love them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank
Thank you,
you. Oh,
system.
thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this idea that like, you got to go. Woo. Like, think, if it had feelings, I'd be like, excuse
Excuse
me.
me.
Right. Like, what do you mean? I like helped you
We were
through long
besties.
times of your life.
Like,
We were besties. Right. So it's like, you have to be very careful
mm-hmm.
and to really think of it as an entity. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I love, there's a quote that a colleague of mine says, Dr. Alexandra Solomon, she says, um, our, our gifts and our pain are next door neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
That's important because so many of us, you and me, we know, and a lot of people listening are going to say, I wouldn't be who I am today without what I went through. You're right. Of course you wouldn't be, right? Your gifts, so many of our gifts, right? They come out of the pain, the wounds, the trauma, right? I don't miss a beat.
Oh no,
My
I am
memory is so
reliable.
damn good.
Yeah, exactly.
I watched every detail because I was around somebody who switched details so up here, I don't miss a beat. I remember everything. You can't get anything by me. This is a gift. It's part of why I'm a great therapist, right? It's like I can remember all of the things I'm tracking. I see what's going on, right? It's like I got really good at that, right? So we know so many of our gifts come from this place. But there's a point in our lives where we're either going to continue to be motivated by the pain, or it's going to be motivated by the healing. Sometimes people are afraid that if I do this healing work, I'm going to lose my gifts. You're not going to lose your gifts. You're not going to lose your gifts. And why this is important is that like we're having to work with this. Like they're not going to go away entirely. Where you're like, is there ever a day where it's not anyway? It's like they hang out with us sometimes, but like maybe less frequently, or they're like under a rock, or oh gosh, what was that movie? Um shoot, American Mind Dream. What was the? Do you remember the guy was a professor in Princeton University? He was schizophrenic. He was
Oh,
seeing
yeah, yeah. A
things.
Beautiful Mind. I think
A
it's A
Beautiful
Beautiful
Mind,
Mind. Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Not American Mind. I was
Oh,
just watching American Symphony last night. A Beautiful Mind,
I was
right? And you
too.
know how at the
Oh my
how
goodness.
amazing.
Oh,
Okay, we'll talk about
amazing.
that later.
Mind
Um,
blown.
you you know how at the end of that movie he sees who he sees at the end, but he's like, no, no, are they there? And the guy he's talking to is like, no, right? And it's like they visit less frequently, right?
Mm,
It's like, and I have more tools with them. It does not mean that your system is never going to respond to something that it has experienced as a threat before, but you're going to check in with it differently. You relate to it differently. That pause, that gap that we were just talking about, it keeps extending, right? The more that we practice it, the muscle gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So you get to a place in your life where it never is around. No, I don't think so. And I also don't think that that's the goal, because thank you so much.
mm.
You don't need to be gone. Like, thank you so much for helping me survive. Thank you so much for helping me get to the other side. You could stay right here, but I just don't need you as much, right? I don't need you to be here as much. I've got the wheel now, right? Because we're mature, wise adults. I've got the wheel now, so I don't need you to take the wheel anymore, right? That's the
Yeah.
goal. And so I think there's almost a level of respect with it, and that we're not trying to reject or throw you out or get rid of you, right? But it's like, I'm going to relate to you differently, but I'm also going to have a lot of gratitude for you because you saved me. You helped me survive. You helped me get through that thing.
That's so helpful. That's so
Mm.
helpful. That really does shift my paradigm a bit. I feel like my patterns have been coming up a little bit more recently. And I don't know if it's my kind of ushering into this new realm of toddlerhood, but there's things. And so I was like,
Yeah.
and obviously I have that
Fire
expansion.
back.
Yeah. I'm like, gosh, you
Uh-huh.
just keep coming back. I thought
Uh-huh.
I kind of like created more space around you. And it's been fascinating for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I
Is it
felt
because
like we had a better understanding before, and all of a
mm-hmm.
sudden it's shifted. And so that's been a
Yes.
really interesting experience.
Yeah. Well, it's right, like the stages of life and the
Hmm.
chapters that we're in, it's like maybe you had a different relationship when you were childless. You know what I mean? Right. And so
Yeah.
then it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
"Ooh, I'm in this chapter and I'm in this stage. And so these activations, right? They present again, or we're protecting it against something again. And that's what I mean is like the beauty of life, the beauty of relationships is that as we continue to move through life's journey, the stuff just presents differently.
Yeah. I feel like a protector and my, as a mom, a, protector. And so my vigilance, which again, that
Mhm,
hyper awareness, my on top of everything, my
mhm.
indispensability is just stronger again, because I
Yeah.
find myself like the ultimate protector of my child, and it's intense. And I was like, things were chill for a bit. And so now, like, like there's this,
Mhm,
and I'm again grateful for these skills. And I
mhm,
my when my I became a mom, my husband was like, "Oh my God, it's you, but it's you as a mother." And he was like, "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. Like it's like you 10x." And I was like, "Yeah, I
mhm,
didn't know this was gonna happen." Like I didn't.
mhm. Right. It's like
So
we meet new parts of ourselves
mhm.
in these different chapters and if in these different stages of life. And I think there's got to be a gentleness, right, when the parts show back up. We're like, I thought I dealt with you, And it's like it's back, and it's like, yeah, different chapter, different stage of life, different circumstances. You got to work with me again now, right? It's like you have to. It's like layers of resolution
Yeah,
based
that's
on where in life you are at. Right.
Yeah, I think I just didn't realize because it's
Mhm.
just, it all does feel like an unfolding, but you're right. It feels like layers. This is an evolution.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, I get to, and that was one of the things I was watching you on Instagram and of like, people are like, but I've done all the work. I've been doing the work. And these things are continuing to come up for me. And I loved, how how you responded to that, of just like kind of these, as you said, it was more like this evolution of, we kind of get to step into this next part, and that we're always just kind of dancing with that part of us in a way. And I was like, okay.
Mhm.
I felt a
Yes.
little bit better, but I wanted to bring it up today because I know there are so many other, women and moms that feel that, like feel these shifts and just like, oh my gosh, this kind of, I wouldn't call it, I don't know, would you call it wounding, or just that part of who I was? That again could be a superpower to some, but
Mhm.
I know that it's a part of my wounding too. So I identify
Mhm.
it as wounding. I'm like, people are like, oh gosh,
Yeah.
you're this and you're that. I'm like, how did you become? And I'm like, trauma. Like, you're so on
Mhm.
time. You're so accountable. You trauma,
Trauma.
like
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think you had a question in there, but I probably lost the thread
oh,
on
I was
it.
more
So,
so, I was thinking in terms of, I apologize. When these evolutions come up, what would
mhm.
you, I guess what is the recommendation, just going back to the basics of kind of
Mm.
identifying and acknowledging and
Yes, exactly. Like it when there's that invitation, you got to think of it as an invitation instead of being
okay.
annoyed and frustrated by it, right? Where it's like, yeah, when there's that invitation, when you're like, I thought I put a lid on it. It's like, no, it's back, right? It's like, then it means that there's something else that needs to be acknowledged again, right? Like there's more witnessing that has to happen. It's different than maybe what you did before because it's showing up, with your son instead of, I don't know, an ex. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, okay, in this chapter of life, it's showing up this way, but it's still asking me to witness something, right? There's still more to do here. There's still more to feel here. There's still more to be here, right? And so, yeah, you do go back to the basics. Um, and, I would just encourage, a curiosity as opposed to, the irritation or the frustration or the shame or the guilt or the embarrassment, whatever it is that wants to creep in. I pretty much say, like, we got to trade everything out with curiosity as much as possible, as frequently as possible. Ooh, this is here for a reason. everything's here for a reason. Everything's serving something, even if it's serving something that feels dysfunctional or, disconnected for us. But our behaviors, like I was saying before, they all are serving something. They're protecting something. And that's our job to figure out what's it protecting? And do I need to get back in the driver's seat and say, wise, adult, mature me is here now? Okay. I don't need you to grab the
My
wheel and
12-year-old self
protect
or
in this
somebody.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, yes, back to the basics, but trade out everything with curiosity. Right. Try to bring that compassion. Try to remember that in the activation, something historical is presenting. Our job is to try to figure that out, understand it, connect to it, acknowledge it, honor it.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I wanted to shift a little bit to family dynamics. I know we're living a time as we're recording this, it's during the holiday season, and
Yeah.
there are lots of events and dynamics and all the things. And let's say you are somebody who has been doing the work and you know that you're going to probably come into some confrontation, or just, you're going to do your best to manage that, or maybe kind of circumvent it as best as possible. But what do you recommend if somebody who has been wounded by family, or, has been doing the work around trying to heal a lot of these patterns, but knows they're about to like step into some of that kind of rehashed wounding? Like, maybe that person hasn't shifted how they behave. What would you recommend, if, and obviously, kind of like that dynamic with my grandma, like, we know that's not going to change. Like, you're going to get what you're going to get. And so, like, do you recommend people limit their time? Do you recommend people lovingly set boundaries? I'd love to hear a little bit about, like, how do we navigate some of these crunchy moments where we're going to step into some of it?
Yeah, all the healing in the world somehow goes out that window. I love the Ram Dass quote that's like, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your
Yeah.
family. Like, yep, there it is. Important reminders.
Yes.
Stop being surprised by unsurprising things. I've been saying that a lot lately. Stop being surprised by unsurprising things, right? Remember who you know this person to be, right? We often find ourselves, well, maybe it's going to be different. I'm going to be hopeful. I'm going to think it's going to, we start entering into this space instead of being very clear with ourselves of what it is that we know we can expect. I think sometimes when we remind ourselves what it is we know that we can expect, we can be a little bit more prepared for that. Yes, of course, boundaries. You can limit your time. You do not need to stay overnight. You don't need to spend 3 days there. You have choice, right? As an adult, you have choice. A part of healing is the restoration of choice, because so much of our pain and wounding and trauma comes the absence of choice. You have choice as an adult. You can get up from the table. You can go take a breather outside. You can go for a walk. You can have somebody on speed dial. You could do whatever you need to do. You can leave early if you want to. And all of those things are available to you. Okay. So honor them if you need to. Don't lock horns. Like, we want to try to change people's minds and perspectives, and you want to use your voice and you want to stand up for something, right? It's like, I feel very strongly about the moment you step into a power dynamic, a power struggle, you lose. They're unbudgeable. They're not going to shift. You're not going to convince, no matter how sweetly or how much you're screaming it, or whatever data points and research you're bringing to the table. Right? Stop locking horns with people. All that does is create suffering. All that does is create misery. It's like you're interacting with a bot. It's like, stop engaging the bots, right? It's like, if you know that it's not a conversation that has ever gone anywhere productive, right? Then choose to disengage, choose to exit, choose not to put your energy there, right? So much of this is like stepping in with the awareness. What do I know to be true? What can I expect? Sometimes we have to prepare for certain things. Okay, if somebody starts drinking too much, or if somebody starts talking about this subject, I want to talk about this subject, or somebody wants to make a comment about, I don't know, something about me, how I look, what my weight is, the fact that I'm not here with a partner, when the grandbabies come in, whatever the comment might be, right? It's like preparing yourself for that response and also what you can do that is soothing and supportive and grounding for you. And so I think so much of this, yes, we're recording around the holidays, but regardless, like anytime we're in these interactions with family, and it's like remember these things and go into that, uh, you know, just sort of checking off some of those boxes before you actually enter into that system to prepare yourself well for it.
Mm, that's so helpful. So, so very helpful. I really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much wisdom today, especially in the end of just like our dynamics and managing everyone right now during this time and during any time. And I know you have a brand new podcast that you just launched. Would you love to
Yeah.
share the details of that?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah. This keeps happening. It's a show where I speak with anonymous guests. So, it's not therapy. I don't know the people. It's a one-time 1 hour consultation, but it is a little like peek into what kind of happens behind, the therapeutic closed doors, if you will. And it's really incredible. It's actually so much harder than therapy because I don't know the people and I have like a couple of sentences about them before we get started, but otherwise I don't know anything. And it's remarkable to just be a part of the process of like what can happen when people sit down together and speak and are open and willing to be challenged and willing to explore and work towards something even though it's such a short amount of time. I think people are really like surprised by how much gets accomplished. I have been blown away by my guests. So that's been a really fun project. And obviously the book The Origins of You, it's been, yeah, what a journey with it. Some of the wounds that get activated even as you write a book. Who knew?
Oh, I bet.
And
Ooh.
yeah, just so lovely to have it out in the world. It became a national bestseller. So exciting. And so, yeah, I just love hearing from people how impactful the book has been for them. And that's why I wrote it. So
Well, thank you, and congratulations on that as well. I knew that it had become a
thank
national
you.
bestseller, such a big deal, and it's so
Yeah.
powerful. And so I just want to really, as a testament, as someone who's read the book, and I just was so excited to dive into it, and it's been so helpful for me. Like even if you feel like you've done the work, like there's just so much that your approach and the gentleness, and it's just the way that you present the content is just beautiful, and it's been such a just such a gift to me. So I know that there's so many women who are going to benefit from it and so many people in general. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day.